We'll go ahead and proceed.
Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing today? Good. Before introducing our speaker today, I would like to highlight some brief announcements. This Sunday, the Senior Art Exhibit opened in the Olin and Smoyer Galleries. The art exhibit consists of a variety of works in different styles and media by the graduating senior art majors. The exhibit runs until May 8th, and the admission is free. Also, on Thursday, April 22nd at 7:30, the Roanoke College Band will present their spring concert. The program will include selections by the various college instrumental ensembles, including the concert band, the jazz ensemble, the flute choir, among others. The concert will be held in Olin Theater, and there is no charge. Lastly, on April 25th at 4 p.m., the Kadinsky Trio and Friends will perform. Violinist Teresa Lynn and violist Scott Rawls will join the trio for a special concert. The price is $12, and it will be held in the Olin Theater. For ticket information, you can call the box office at 375, and you know what, I didn't get the last four numbers. I forgot to write them down. I think it's something like 2320 or something like that. I was going to ask Steve, but he left on me, so. 2333. I'm so sorry about that. I left it blank and I forgot about it. And the last thing before I introduce our speaker today is the menu for today. Some people were asking already, so we always have our soup du jour. Who knows what it is, but it's there. The chicken stuffed with broccoli, broiled scrod, a baked potato bar, green beans, Brew City fries, which are a little spicier than the normal fries we have, garden burgers, turkey burgers, hamburgers and hot dogs, and the pasta bar, the deli bar, and the dessert bar. I know some people are asking if we're going to still have that. So. Next, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Gil Dunn. Dr. Dunn received his bachelor's degree at Ohio Wesleyan University. He then went on to receive his master's degree at Tulane University and his Ph.D. at the University of Virginia. Dr. Dunn has been teaching here at Roanoke College since 1993. Before coming to Roanoke, Dr. Dunn taught in Europe through the University of Maryland's overseas program. His teaching posts included stints in Iceland, Germany, Belgium, and Italy. Dr. Dunn is a member of the National Honor Fraternity Phi Beta Kappa. He also serves as the president of the Phi Beta Kappa chapter here at Roanoke College. Dr. Dunn's interests include social theory and the sociology of religion. Today, Dr. Dunn will be discussing the turning points in civil rights. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gil Dunn.
I'm going to try to speak to you without the microphone. I hate those things for some reason. So if I'm not talking loud enough, let me know. Maybe somebody could shut the doors back there a little bit. So if you have trouble hearing me, let me know, and I'll try to increase the volume a little bit. You have a handout before you. Turning points in civil rights in this century is such a huge topic. I've tried to come up with 2 or 3 focal points, and the main focal point will be a very influential book by Gunnar Myrdal entitled "An American Dilemma." What I plan to do is talk about this book and mesh it in with some events, some significant happenings in history. Talk for about 25, 30 minutes, give you a chance to ask questions, make comments, and then show a little stretch of a video about the Freedom Summer of 1964 that will give you a little bit of a flavor and feel for the undercurrent of violence and on some things that I can't really project in a talk. Well, I think the main thing that's happened over the last 100 years is a switch from civil rights being considered a matter of individual morality to one of a social problem, a matter of social ethics. The issue of social ethics has actually been dealt with in the courts. A lot of this is tied to a very influential book, An American Dilemma, by the eminent Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal. Let me just, so I'm dealing with Roman numeral 1 here on your handout. Let me just set the stage for this book. If you can remember back to the early 1950s, America was really riding high in the international community. People were talking about, people were writing books about the American century. We had been the dominant force in the victory in World War II. Our economy was dominated the world. We were the most powerful military force in the world. We were also looked upon as a beacon of freedom, an ideal of liberty. America was not just another country, not just another powerful country, but really a role model for the entire international community. But one embarrassment for the United States was civil rights, particularly treatment of our non-white citizens. Here's a nation that sets itself up as the land of opportunity, the beacon of freedom, and yet large numbers of its own citizens are treated as second-class citizens, primarily because of race or ethnicity. So a number of foundation heads, people who ran these philanthropic foundations like the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, they decided that it'd be good to have a study of discrimination, of civil rights, this American problem, and they decided to get someone from outside the United States, someone who was not an American, to do the study. And they selected Gunnar Myrdal, who had already been awarded a Nobel Prize for his interdisciplinary work in economics and sociology. I think this is interesting because perhaps an American would be all wrapped up in the emotions of the issue, would not be able to see the forest or the trees. Someone who was not an American could have a little different angle, a different slant on the problem. Well, a number of important things developed from the publication of this classic 2-volume work. It's still read in graduate school today, and it's considered must reading for people who want to pursue an advanced degree in something like African American studies or race and ethnicity in America. One thing that Myrdal challenged was the bootstrap mentality. The idea that if people are not doing well, they can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, focusing on dealing with problems within a particular group. So if a particular group is not succeeding or not doing as well in American society, it's incumbent upon that group itself to try to pull itself up by its bootstraps, focus more on education, obey the law more, tighten up on the family situation, things like this. Myrdal challenged that notion, said that the largest problems faced by minorities in the United States are really outside of their control. that they exist in patterns of discrimination that originate in the dominant society. So this shifted the emphasis from groups pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Now, Myrdal was not saying these things were not important, that groups should focus on education and so forth, but that the main problems should be recognized as problems that were outside of the control of the minority groups, particularly African Americans. And when we talk about civil rights in the United States, really we're talking primarily about black-white relations. This set the agenda for civil rights as and the ramifications that have spilled over into gender, sexual preference, and so on. But really, civil rights has dealt primarily in this century with the issue of race, and race has set the agenda for other matters. So Myrdal said that we should focus on patterns of discrimination. And the most serious problems were actually problems that were not generally recognized. We've seen race riots and covered in the news media, particularly back at this time on some military installations. There was a big riot at Fort Dix, New Jersey. But Myrdal was saying the biggest problems were things beneath the surface, things that were not immediately recognizable. He said that obviously bigoted, blatant acts of discrimination are actually much easier to deal with because they're so easy to recognize. You could see the Bull Connor in Alabama, or the images of the Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council in the Deep South. That the bigger problems had to do with institutional and systemic discrimination. So I'll try to talk about that a little bit now. Just to review, though, Myrdal's book placed the emphasis on patterns of discrimination that originate in the dominant society, that the minority groups, people who are discriminated against, don't have much control over. This challenged the bootstrap mythology, and it also kind of called attention to what Myrdal felt was a tendency to blame the victim. That when large numbers of people are discriminated against, they're often blamed for having a high crime rate and an unstable family situation and so on. These kind of ideas, I think, are fairly commonplace today, but the bootstrap mythology was dominant in the immediate post-World War II era. Roman numeral 2 presents the typology that Myrdal came up with, and I think understanding this typology helps us to make sense out of all the events that we know about, all these momentous historical events that occurred during the 20th century. Myrdal's typology of course, just lists different types of discrimination. And the typology identifies individual discrimination, institutional discrimination, and systemic discrimination. And I've drawn a little arrow over here on the left-hand side indicating severity, that the problem becomes more severe as we move from individual to institutional and finally systemic. Well, individual discrimination is the kind of thing that we're all familiar with. Face-to-face, ugly, bigoted behavior, something like calling people racial slurs or something like this. And I think our society has really done well in eliminating a lot of this. There's still some of it around. It's largely disreputable. People who are reputable members of society usually don't condone it. It's easy to recognize. And I think there's probably, it's safe to say there's less of it today than there was, say, back in the 50s and 60s. Again, it's not completely eliminated. I've mentioned here this horrible dragging case in Lubbock, where a black man was murdered apparently just because he was black. So we still have these problems, these horrible, bigoted, blatant acts, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, according to Myrdal. The more serious problems are things that are a little bit more difficult to identify, and these have to do with institutional and systemic discrimination. A lot of this has been dealt with in the courts recently, and I'll try to focus on that just a little bit. Institutional discrimination, rather than being face-to-face, represents an organizational policy. And so often reputable people can be involved in this. And it is largely reputable. It's legally sanctioned, and even though it clearly has a discriminatory impact on a certain group of people, it has the legitimacy of being upheld by law. So an example of this a few years ago would be the policy by the Little League not to allow girls to play Little League baseball. I think this has been changed. But this was an organizational policy. So you would have a lot of reputable coaches saying, I don't really agree with the policy. I don't have anything against girls. Some of my best friends are girls, but girls, can't play. That's the rule. And this was considered to be okay, and so forth. Another example would be the ban on homosexuals in the military. I'm not exactly sure what the status on that is now, but traditionally in our society we've banned homosexuals from the military, and this has been upheld by the courts. That a large number of people would say, well, surely, we can see that this discriminates against homosexuals, but there's a good reason for this. That maybe it's a security or a morale issue. I'm not exactly sure what the thinking is or what the status is, but at any rate, this was something that clearly discriminated against a group of people, but it was upheld by the sanction of law. One of the frustrating things about all of this is sometimes institutional discrimination is layered, and you have to peel back several layers before you can get at the heart of the problem. Myrdal gave the example of a young black man showing up at a construction site looking for a job and asking the foreman if he was hiring, and the foreman said, "Yes, I need workers, but I can't hire you right now because you have to be a member of the union." And so then the guy goes to the union, and the people in the union say, "Well, we'd like to sign you up right now, but you have to have an apprenticeship for, say, 50 hours with somebody who's already a member of the union." So then the guy starts calling people up to try to arrange this, and keeps getting the brush off, people setting appointments and not showing up. He'd been much better off. Essentially the union didn't want blacks in there. He'd been better off if he just ran into a blatant racist at the construction site. At least he wouldn't have wasted his time and gone through all of that frustration. The thing that's a little bit difficult to understand, and I think really important though for getting a comprehensive view of civil rights in this century, is systemic discrimination. Systemic discrimination is just like institutional discrimination, except it's invisible. Most people would argue that it doesn't even have anything to do with discrimination. Myrdal would say, well, because people can't even recognize it as having anything to do with discrimination, it's really hard to do something about it. How do you solve a problem that you can't even recognize? a characteristic of systemic discrimination is that it's upheld by taken for granted knowledge and values. This is, you know, we take this for granted without even thinking about it, and we don't even think it has anything to do with discrimination or civil rights. The legal terms for this, the policies are fair in form or mutual on the face. Nothing looks wrong with them on the surface, but some of them are starting to be challenged in the courts. Let me give you an example of a couple of forms or some things that would illustrate systemic discrimination. One is the common policy in this nation of reverse seniority when it comes to company layoffs. If a corporation or a factory needs to reduce its workforce, layoffs have to occur when there's an economic slowdown, something like this. How do we do this? Well, we do it according to seniority, essentially. The phrases, the last hired, first fired. And this seems like, this is the only fair way to do it. If you have to lay people off, you can't lay someone, it's not fair to lay someone off who's been working for you for 30 years and keep someone on who's just been working for you for 5 years. But the problem is that what about all the sectors of the economy, all the occupational areas that have only recently opened up opportunities, say, to blacks or women? Who's going to be hurt the most by reverse seniority, by laying off the last hired first? It would be blacks and women. This might not seem like much, but if you add a whole bunch of these things together, the cumulative effect can be very significant. Some companies have traditionally used redlining where they'll identify certain areas, often zip codes, that have high default rates on loans, a lot of problems with arson, and it's much more difficult for people to get credit, to get financial assistance, mortgages in these areas. The companies are thinking, well, this is, what we're trying to do is make a profit for our stockholders. We don't really care what color people are or anything like this. We just want to make a profit. Some of these redlining tactics have been found unconstitutional in the courts, but of course it's very difficult to enforce this type of thing. It's something that still goes on quite a bit. And again, I think the idea here is that these are not people who are people involved in this, or people who are not hiding behind hoods with the Ku Klux Klan or violent, bigoted people. It's often people like you and I. We can sympathize with a personnel director at a large company that has to lay off people, and he or she would probably swear, I'm not prejudiced. I'm not racist or anything. I don't care if a person's black, green, purple, whatever. What can I do? You have to, the only fair thing is to have a reverse seniority policy. So you have a lot of well-meaning, fair-minded, compassionate people actually helping to perpetuate many forms of systemic discrimination. Let me give you an example of a case in systemic discrimination that came up in the courts. Let me backtrack a little bit. An example of institutional discrimination that some of you might have heard about is the LaFleur versus Chesterfield case in suburban Richmond. LaFleur was an English teacher who was pregnant, and she and her husband decided that they wanted her to finish out the school year. The school system back then, this was back in the 60s, had a policy that if a woman were pregnant teaching, she would have to take a leave of absence and have the child and then return. She would get her job back, but she had to take a leave of absence. She talked about it with her husband and her doctor. Said, well, you know, there's no reason why you can't finish out the semester. In fact, it would probably be better for you to be on your feet and active. But the school board's policy, they didn't want a pregnant woman visible, I guess, to the students. I don't know what the thinking was back then, but LaFleur fought this all the way to the Supreme Court and won, and it had ramifications to the to all sorts of other industries, the airline industry, the military, and so on. That was clearly institutional discrimination, a policy by a school board that clearly has something to do with, in this case, gender. Court case involving systemic discrimination is the Griggs versus Duke Power and Electric Company case out of North Carolina. Duke Power and Electric, of course, is the big utility down in North Carolina. Griggs was a black man who was a freelance electrician. He was in his late 50s. He worked for himself, but he did a lot of work for the power company. He had a reputation of being really good at working on. In fact, they went to Griggs for some of the problems that their regular workers couldn't handle. Griggs had several children, and he had diabetes, and he was starting to worry about his health benefits and so forth, and he wanted to work. Some people encouraged him, why don't you just work for the power company? You're doing most of the work anyway. And so he went to apply for the job primarily because he wanted the benefits, the security for his family and so forth. The problem was that the power company had a set of written examinations that all applicants had to take, no matter what they were doing. And like a lot of black men in his late 50s, Griggs was very poorly educated. He had gone to school in segregated schools. To make a long story short, he couldn't pass the tests. These tests were pretty simple to someone that had had an adequate education, but I think he'd only been through the 8th grade in a rural, segregated North Carolina school system. And it had a section on arithmetic and a section on English usage. He flunked both sections. Well, he didn't like this. He couldn't get a job because he couldn't pass the test, and he knew he could do the work better than a lot of people that couldn't pass the test. So this developed into a court case. You can imagine how the Duke Power and Electric Company people would say, well, we're not racist. We have black people who pass the test. We have white people who flunk the test. What's the problem? Everybody's treated the same. But the lawyers for Griggs argued that unless the policy has a direct effect on actual job duties, and if the policy has a disproportionately negative effect on a group of people, then it does constitute a civil rights violation. And Griggs won his case. So we're talking about some ethical matters, some legal matters, dealing with categories of people, not necessarily individuals. And this is sometimes hard for us to get used to. But at any rate, Myrdal would say this would be a perfect example of systemic discrimination that Griggs ran into, and that it shows how the United States, particularly in its legal system, is starting to recognize some of these issues and try to correct them. Even though you still have large numbers of people throughout society who can't even recognize this as being a problem. A lot of people would say, what's Griggs complaining about? He had a fair chance to take the test. He flunked it. There's nothing devious about this. I don't see what the problem is. That maybe sometimes you can hear that this is something like this would be reverse discrimination. The last thing I have here, I want to emphasize just a couple of really pivotal years. Of course, we all know about 1954. This was the famous Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. That's considered a landmark case because it reversed the precedent set in the earlier Plessy versus Ferguson case, back in the late 1890s. This was really the death knell for Jim Crow. It claimed, it argued that the doctrine of separate but equal was inherently unequal, could no longer be used. Of course, segregation didn't just end in 1954. There was massive resistance. Much of the massive resistance was centered in Virginia, and there's still a lot of areas of society that have a lot of de facto segregation. But we all know about this case. And then in 1964, a whole series of events. If I had to pick one year, I think 1964 would be really the other pivotal year. This is the Freedom Summer, the students going down to Mississippi, and the people in the civil rights workers that were found in the earthen, their bodies were found in the earthen dam, and this huge manhunt, and the assassination of Medgar Evers, the NAACP leader for the state of Mississippi, shot in the back by a person who left his fingerprints on the rifle, but was not convicted. The argument about the seating of the delegates at the Democratic National Convention, and then Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. All of these things happened in that year of Freedom Summer. I have a little video that shows some things about Freedom Summer in 1964. But before I show this, I thought I'd give you a chance to talk or ask questions or disagree with anything I've said. Yes?
I'm not doing either of it. I just thought it was interesting. They were talking about institutional discrimination. There was an article in today's paper about black men complaining about the position at the IRS. That it's just a job, not a career, because there's no forward move. So it's government institutions.
Okay. The comment was that there's an item in the paper today about black employees for the Internal Revenue Service are complaining that they're just they don't have much of a career trajectory, and they have the jobs and the careers go to. I'm not familiar with that case, but this probably would be either institutional or systemic discrimination.
I don't think that it is a case at this time. I just think it was an article of interviews.
It's at the stage where people are disgruntled about the situation, and they, Yes.
What do you think about women in service?
Well, obviously, this has been an issue about gender equality in the service. I think that probably you could see, we have women in the military now. You can see a lot of forms of systemic discrimination at work, so that we don't have anywhere near equality between the sexes in the military, and so now women are usually held out of combat situations, and but again, to return to this comment about a career versus a job, if you want to really have a distinguished career in the military, you need to be involved in combat. So if you're not involved in combat, there's a certain ceiling. So women are not. So I think and if you've ever, I spent a lot of time on military installations in Germany, and I saw so many women typing and doing child care and teaching and so forth. It's clearly not an equal situation. But some people feel they have no business being in the service at all, and that it creates morale problems, and that's an issue I really can't deal with. Yeah.
On that topic, my son was in the Air Force at Paris. Many of the females did not have the leg strength
Yeah.
to stop the planes. That's a problem.
Okay.
But besides, nearly every country, Germany, France, England, China, Japan, all have great areas of discrimination. Why are we picking on us? And when we try to, and when our courts try to solve this problem, we end up with worse discrimination. As I remember a memo coming down from the top of my organization, it said job openings so bottom line, women and minorities will be given preference.
Yeah. Okay, the question is, discrimination exists in all kinds of other countries, and why are we so concerned about it, or why blame us or something?
Because we're the greatest generation.
Yeah. There is that argument that America is held to a higher standard, that we present ourselves as the land of opportunity, the land of the free, and that we ought to live up to our rhetoric and our Constitution. With regard to the reverse discrimination, a lot of these cases have been adjudicated, and the courts have been ruling, I think, in a way that you would approve of. They have identified some cases of reverse discrimination. That probably heard about that Bakke case a while back with the white white male who was denied admission to med school. He won his case. So the courts do allow for corrections in some of these things, but I think that one of the reasons these cases are going to continually come up is we have certain things. It's not just a matter of feeling guilty or feeling blame. There are certain things in our Constitution, in our tradition, in our traditions, and in the notion of the social gospel that are going to compel people to identify discrimination and violations of civil rights, and they will do so. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Who pays for legal costs for all these?
My question is about the legal cost. I guess it's expensive, and sometimes taxpayers, sometimes groups. The ACLU, which is not a very popular organization in some circles, they funded the Griggs defense, and so it comes from a variety of sources. I guess some people, someone like Myrdal would say the costs of discrimination are much greater than what we would gain from reducing it significantly. Yeah.
Why are young ladies not subject to the draft?
No, nobody's subject to the draft. Yeah.
They've got to sign up.
Oh, they got to sign up. Yeah.
But women don't.
Good question. I would think if a woman or if a man were to file a court case on that, maybe it might go somewhere. Who knows? Yeah. Question here.
How does the policy in the military of don't ask and don't tell fit into all of this?
Well, I admit that I'm not really up to date on exactly what the status is of the military. I understand that Clinton at one time advocated this don't ask, don't tell policy, but I'm not sure if that's the letter of the law. It's ran into some snags, didn't it? So I think I'm not sure what the status of that is. But all I can say is traditionally homosexuals have been banned from the military. And I have no interest in arguing whether that's good or bad. I don't really know. But I can say that there are certain patterns that show up that are related to systemic discrimination. For example, we have preferential employment policies in the post office for veterans. There are written regulation that veterans should be given preference to post office jobs. Well, if gays are not allowed to serve in the military, they're not going to be allowed to have preferential treatment for post office jobs. So nobody would walk around saying homosexuals don't have a fair shake with the post office. But yet, you know, these are things that are not recognizable, and maybe they shouldn't have a fair shake with the post office. I don't know, but they certainly these are things that are beneath the surface. I think Myrdal would say, if you can use some imagery here, Myrdal would say that individual discrimination, the kind of thing that all of us abhor, all of us in this room, I'm sure, you know, using racial slurs, setting fire to school buses, throwing bricks at kids who are trying to integrate a beach, or this horrible Lubbock case. Individual discrimination is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and it's melting down. There's less of it today, clearly, than there was back in the heyday of Wallace and Thurmond and so on. But beneath the surface, there's some bulky masses of institutional and systemic discrimination. And to use a navigational analogy, you know, that's the dangerous part of an iceberg. That you're floating along on a ship and you're looking out, there's not a very big tip there, and boom, you smack into something beneath the surface. How about, I'll tell you what, how about two more questions, and now I want to show you a little bit of this video, okay? Try on this side of the room here.
I'm going to make a statement.
Okay.
I don't have a question. I'm born and raised, or reared, in Alabama. So I have discrimination against me because I'm from Alabama. Black people ask me, well, I didn't take part in any of that. It was just the way I grew up. And I spent 2 years in Missouri. And I was very much discriminated. Everybody was in war more than we were in the South.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. Why pick on me? I didn't do anything. I think I can see that.
That's before you showed the movie.
I don't really know what to say about something like that. I mean, I guess if the feeling is that, well, a certain group of people is going to have to pay a price or something to make amends, or but I would say it seems like whites, particularly white men, are managing to stand up fairly well to the discrimination they face. Even white men in Alabama.
A lot of the media act like this is the only thing they do in the South.
Okay. I lived in Mississippi. I know what you're talking about. It's defiance. Another question over here.
Recognize that gentleman over there.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right.
Are you familiar with the discriminatory policy, I guess, on in academic areas? No publish, no promotion. You know that?
Oh yeah, I know that.
I'll throw that out because sometimes things like that are very much overlooked.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are a lot of forms of discrimination that are overlooked. I think that's one that sometimes even in some areas of our society, Catholics are discriminated against, and sometimes people who are fundamentalist Christians are discriminated against.
You don't have that on this campus, but I'm talking
the academic world is clearly moving toward the publish or perish idea, and some people feel that's a problem because the main thing that people should be doing is teaching young people, not writing articles. So that's it's a difficult balance there. But I think your overall point that there's some forms of discrimination that are not immediately recognizable.
Closely relied to that is empirical research.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, could I show a little bit of this video? All right, just to give you a little flavor of this.
You're gonna photograph.
This won't. I won't hold you too long. Let's see, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we go to lunch. This is Freedom Summer 1964. This is Jackson, Mississippi.
The leader in Jackson and throughout the state was Medgar Evers, NAACP State Field Secretary. Evers had supported James Meredith during the battle to integrate the University of Mississippi. For 10 years, he had traveled the state, fighting for racial justice, and now helped organize the NAACP boycott of downtown stores.
Don't shop for anything on Capitol Street. Let's let the merchants down Capitol Street feel the economic pinch. Let me say this to you. I had one merchant to call me, and he said, I want you to know that I've talked to my national office today, and they want me to tell you that we don't need mega business. These are stores that help to support the White Citizens Council, the council that is dedicated to keeping you and I second-class citizens. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be demonstrating here until freedom comes for Negroes here in Jackson, Mississippi.
In June 1963, students in Jackson poured out of their schools to protest the beatings and arrest of demonstrators in downtown citizens. In response, Jackson officials put police and firemen on 24-hour alert with orders to contain the demonstrators.
Hi, did you hear me?
Hundreds were arrested. Mayor Allen Thompson announced that Jackson could handle 10,000 if necessary. The attitude of Jackson city officials was another reminder that blacks in Mississippi would have no real power until they had the power to elect those who govern them.
If you are not a registered voter, remember this one thing, that Adam Johnson got in the mayor's office by the majority of the folks who were qualified to vote and voted on the day that he was elected. Ross Barnett got in office because he was elected by the majority of the folks who were qualified to vote and voted on the day that he was elected. And if you don't like this thing, let's get it back and change.
Demonstrators were not backing down and many were being injured. For Medgar Evers, the situation grew more dangerous with every passing day.
It was simply in the air. You knew that something was going to happen, and the logical person going to happen to was Medgar. It certainly brought us closer during that time. As a matter of fact, we didn't talk. We didn't have to. We communicated without words. It was a touch, it was a look, it was holding each other, it was music playing, And I used to try to reassure him and tell him, nothing's going to happen to you. The FBI is here. Laugh. Everybody knows you. You're in the press. They wouldn't dare do anything to you.
On June 11, 1963, Myrlie Evers watched at home as President John Kennedy made his strongest speech on civil rights.
It is not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section of the country or another, or to throw the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting change as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality.
Late that night he came home. The children were still up. I was asleep across the bed, and we heard the motor of the car coming in and pulling into the driveway. We heard him get out of the car, and the car door slammed, and in that same instance we heard the loud gunfire. The children fell to the floor as he had taught them to do. I made a run for the front door, turned on the light, and there he was. The force of the bullet had pushed him forward, as I understand. And the strong man that he was, he had his keys in his hand and had pulled his body around the rest of the way to the door. There he lay, and I screamed, and people came out. Our next door neighbor fired a gun, as he said, to try to frighten me and run away. And I knew then that that was it.
Medgar Evers had been shot in the back by a single round from a high-powered rifle. The one fingerprint found on the weapon belonged to Byron de la Beckwith, a member of the Citizens Council in Greenwood, Mississippi. Medgar Evers, 37 years old, died 1 hour later.
When Medgar was felled by that shot, and I rushed out and saw him lying there, and people from the neighborhood began to gather. There were also some whose color happened to have been white. I don't think I have ever hated as much in my life as I did at that particular moment with anyone who had white skin. I screamed at the neighbors, and when the police finally got there, I told them that they had killed Medgar. And I can recall wanting so much to have a machine gun or something in my hands and just stand there and mow them all down. I was just, I can't explain the depth of my hatred at that point.
We view this as a cold, brutal, deliberate killing in a savage, uncivilized state. The most savage, the most uncivilized state in the entire 50 states. There is no state with a record that approaches that of Mississippi in inhumanity, murder, brutality, and racial hatred. It is absolutely at the bottom of the list.
In Jackson, in 1963, there lived a man who was brave. He fought for freedom all of his life, but they laid Medgar in his grave.
On the day that Medgar was funeral, I mean, there was an violence, and there was no way to predict it. There was a different element for people. who had never participated in the movement before. The guys off the street who just angry, you know, who that at that time is we had very little contact with in the Jackson area. We had mostly worked in through churches, we had worked through students, young people, and then just people in general, you know. The street people we had not really worked with as well because they didn't want to admit it, because they always felt that they could not cope with the non-docs. Not that they disagreed with what the movement, it's just that the tactics they used. You know, that particular day, that group of people decided to speak out. Police departments and others came there. They actually antagonized people. They were there in full battalion gear with the right armor on and guns, and they were being pretty rough with the people on the street. And the people just said, we're not going to take that. This is a funeral of our leader, and here they are, you know, harassing us, and the white people killed them.
Shots had already been fired when John Doerr, a Justice Department attorney, stepped between the crowds and the police. With the help of Dave Dennis and others, Doerr convinced both sides to back off. The demonstrators went home. Medgar Evers was buried in Arlington Cemetery with full military honors. No one was ever convicted of his murder. The assassination of Medgar Evers focused national attention on a state which seemed at war with half of its own citizens. As anger grew, so did a concern that Mississippi could never be made to change from within. Civil rights leaders and sympathetic whites traveled to the South to see firsthand the state called the closed society.
So I think all I tried to do with this video is give you a little bit of a flavor, just to see some of those images, and there was a lot of violence, and even most of us can remember, you know, like a few of us saw violence firsthand, but we can remember the undercurrent of violence, the tension of that era, and seeing some of this allows you to get a feel for it in a way that you could never get it from an outline or from my words. The events that unfolded after the Medgar Evers assassination, there were the civil rights workers found in the earthen dam in Philadelphia, the controversy over the Democratic seating of the delegates of the Democratic National Convention, Freedom Summer, students pouring in from colleges all over the country into Mississippi and Alabama and so on, and then this all culminating with Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, something that has ramifications up to today. Sorry, I know a lot of you had a lot of things to say, and I had to, you know, I wish I could hear everyone, but I think I've been told we have to go to lunch.